Sansa Stark stood on the balcony of the Red Keep, her hands clasped in front of her, the faint breeze from Blackwater Bay lifting a few loose strands of her auburn hair. She had always been a dreamer, but she had learned that dreams in King's Landing came at a terrible price. Where once she had cringed at courtly intrigues, she now viewed them as pieces on a sivas board, each move calculated for advantage. Though her heart still trembled in moments of vulnerability, her mind had sharpened. She had survived Joffrey's cruelty, but her fate would not be survival alone. She longed to thrive, to outmaneuver the vipers and the lions alike. To do so, she had to become a lion in spirit, if not in name. Her first lessons in the dangers of innocence had come swiftly when her father, Lord Eddard Stark, was named Hand of the King. In that earlier time, Sansa was all courtesy and compliance, always eager to please, to follow the rules of chivalry and storybook ideals. But those same ideals had shattered on the day her father lost his head for treason he had not committed. In the aftermath, Sansa's dreams of a true knight's rescue vanished into the glare of Joffrey Baratheon's mockery. Each day, she endured new humiliations. Each moment was a reminder of just how powerless she could be. Yet in the weeks following her father's death, an inkling of cunning sparked in Sansa's mind. Perhaps it was the sight of her sister Arya's absence, reminding her that not all Starks were sheep to be shorn. Or perhaps it was the necessity of survival. She learned to speak softly, to flatter Joffrey's vanity, to close her eyes to what she could not stomach. But deep down, she planned and observed. Desperation taught her to recognize the fragility of her position. Still, she was afraid. Her chance came not in a grand, orchestrated moment, but in a subtle shift at court. Lord Tywin Lannister, the true power behind the throne, summoned her unexpectedly. Over the years, Sansa had grown accustomed to the uneasy aura that accompanied the Lannisters. Cersei was cold and sharp, a queen whose edges had been honed by her own frustrations, and Joffrey was cruel. But Lord Tywin was something else entirely, silent, calculating, and merciless when pressed. His gold-flecked eyes seemed to miss nothing. Under the glittering candlelight of the small council chamber, he had asked her a single question: "Will you do your duty to the crown, Lady Sansa?" She recognized in that moment that Tywin offered her a chance. Though she was of the North, though she was a Stark, she was also aware that without protection, her fate would be no better than a hostage's. In a stammered voice, she agreed to whatever Lord Tywin asked. She never expected that her duty would involve something more profound than attending feasts or smiling sweetly at Joffrey's side. But Tywin had recognized her potential as a figurehead, a conduit through which the North might be bent. She was to be a Lannister ally, a willing or unwilling piece on Tywin's game board. And Sansa, deciding survival was not enough, embraced the role as a pathway to influence. At first, her motivations stemmed from fear and self-preservation. But as the months passed, Sansa began to grow adept at the courtesies of manipulation. She paid attention to who spoke with whom in the corridors, whose pockets jingled heavier after an audience with the Queen, and how the slightest shifts in power could echo across the Seven Kingdoms. She learned from Cersei, albeit silently and cautiously, how to feign warmth while plotting betrayal. She watched as Tyrion Lannister fought to maintain his own footing, as men grumbled that the imp was too clever for his station. Above all, she observed how the slightest misstep could land even the most powerful men in mortal peril. A turning point arrived when she was included in the household gatherings of the Lannisters. She sipped wine in the solar with Cersei, always under watchful eyes, and occasionally found herself sharing a dinner table with Lord Tywin. She started to understand the power of presence, a subtle tilt of her head, a courteous laugh at just the right moment. She began to sense that loyalty in King's Landing was as malleable as warm wax. But to mold that wax, she needed the right alliances, the right secrets. And that meant forging bonds with those who were themselves adept at the game. She found an unexpected opportunity in the presence of Lord Peter Baelish, known as Littlefinger. He took an interest in her, though what sort of interest was not entirely clear. He flattered her with words about how she resembled her mother, and Sansa sometimes felt a chill creep up her spine at the intensity in his eyes. Yet with Littlefinger came connections. He whispered that knowledge was power, that with the right information, Sansa might negotiate freedom for herself, might elevate her house, might even claim revenge. But she had to be careful. Peter was a serpent coiled around the throne, ready to strike for his own gain. But the Lannisters were more direct in their approach. Lord Tywin wanted to keep her close, but not too close. Sansa realized that becoming a dutiful daughter to the Lannisters could serve her as much as them. She noticed how the common folk, poor seamstresses, gold cloaks, distant cousins, would stare when she moved through the halls in the company of gold and crimson finery. She let rumors spread that Lady Sansa was becoming a Lannister pet, docile and sweet. Beneath this facade, she was calculating each step, forging friendships with the servants, hearing tidbits about the darkest corners of the city. In the swirling chaos of power, knowledge was the ultimate currency. Joffrey remained as unyielding in his cruelty as ever. Occasionally, he would humiliate Sansa in court, forcing her to kneel or insulting her heritage. But more often now, his mother or his grandfather reigned in his worst impulses. An important piece must be preserved. Sansa, too, learned to mask her revulsion with a demure smile. She learned to deflect his barbs by praising his leadership. His grace is so wise, while never believing a word. And through those small acts, she ingratiated herself further with the Lannisters, who watched her, impressed by her patience and capacity for deception. One day, as she walked in the garden, Tyrion approached her. He spoke quietly, musing that he, too, recognized her transformation. "You used to be so easily frightened," he said, adjusting the hem of his doublet. "Now you're frightening the rest of us." Startled, Sansa let out a small laugh. "I doubt I frightened the great Lannister family," she replied. "On the contrary," Tyrion said, "people who appear harmless are often the most dangerous. And you, Lady Sansa, have the ear of my father." Their eyes met. Sansa was not sure if Tyrion was mocking her or warning her, but she sensed some genuine respect in his words. He was a Lannister, but he was different from the rest. And so she merely inclined her head, filing away his observation as one more piece of intelligence to be used or discarded as needed. Time, in that manner, crept on. The War of the Five Kings wreaked havoc across the realm. Houses rose and fell. Word reached the Red Keep of Robb Stark's victories in the field, and Sansa's heart clenched with conflicting emotions. She missed her family. She loathed seeing the North ravaged. But her daily interactions with Cersei and Tywin reminded her that the North might soon face a far more terrible punishment if it did not bend. She found herself writing letters to Robb, urging caution, urging compromise, a betrayal of sorts, but also a strategic gamble. She told herself that if she had enough standing in King's Landing, she could mitigate any punishments visited upon the North. Perhaps she could save her brother's life or her mother's. She comforted herself with these thoughts, even as she knew that in some sense she was betraying her name. And yet, with every passing day, Sansa sank deeper into the Lannister sphere of influence. The people at court began to call her the Lion's Rose, though never in her hearing. Rumors spread that Lord Tywin might betroth her to another powerful ally to cement the bond. Some whispered that Sansa would become the queen if anything happened to Margaery Tyrell. Others speculated that a marriage alliance with a Martell or a wealthy lord from the Westerlands might be in the works. The idea both thrilled and horrified Sansa. Marriage was a tool in the Game of Thrones, a currency for forging alliances, and she knew that if Tywin willed it, she would have little choice. But Sansa was no longer the naive girl from Winterfell. She had studied the game under her father's nose, though only partially. Her real lessons came here, amid the treachery of the capital. If the Lannisters aimed to shape her destiny, she would strive to shape theirs as well. Beneath her gentle exterior, she nurtured an iron will. She spent long hours perfecting her courtesy, her illusions of compliance. At night, she dreamed of the North, of gray dire wolves racing across the snow. But she never mentioned these dreams. Dreams, she had learned, were safer when hidden. Her first real step into active maneuvering came when she offered Lord Tywin a plan to pacify some of the rebellious lords of the Crownlands. It was modest in scope, arranging more frequent shipments of grain and beef from the Riverlands to King's Landing, ensuring that smaller houses felt the economic pull of the capital. Sansa proposed that if these lords had a stake in the capital's prosperity, they might be less inclined to rebel. It was a move to tie them closer to the Iron Throne. Tywin listened with his usual stony silence, then nodded. "You have your mother's wit," he said at last, though whether it was an insult or a compliment, she could not say. Soon after, she noticed a subtle shift in how the guards treated her. She was escorted by more courteous members of the King's Guard. The gold cloaks bowed a little deeper. Servants hurried to fulfill her requests, no matter how small. Tywin had recognized that Sansa's mind was more than just a repository for the illusions of a southern lady. If she could prove useful in political affairs, she was worth cultivating. And if she was worth cultivating, she might also be worth protecting, so long as her loyalty remained intact. But loyalty to whom? Her father's memory? Her mother's hopes? Her own survival? Sansa found no easy answers. Each day, her illusions of a storybook courtship grew fainter, replaced by pragmatism. She began to relish the small accomplishments of courtly politics. She found joy in the knowledge that her suggestions and alliances bore fruit. And in the darkness of her chambers, she sometimes wondered if she was losing pieces of herself in the process. The crucial moment that steeled her resolve came when word reached King's Landing that Robb Stark had been slain at the Twins, victim of treachery orchestrated by Walder Frey in alliance with Tywin Lannister. Her mother and brother had been killed, their forces decimated. The Red Wedding, it would be called. The news shattered what remained of Sansa's illusions. She collapsed onto the cold floor of her bedchamber, her gown pooling around her like blood. For hours, she mourned, silent tears coursing down her cheeks. She imagined her mother's final moments, her brother's last breath. All gone. But the next morning, she rose before dawn and composed herself. She had no time for the luxury of open grief. She realized then that her position at the Lannister table was not simply about survival anymore. Her family had been butchered. The Lannisters had orchestrated the betrayal. She was living among her father's killers. Yet if she fled or openly rebelled, she would end up like Robb. The only hope for justice or vengeance was to remain exactly where she was, to ascend higher in their esteem, to seize the levers of power from within. So she ate breakfast in silence, ignoring the pitying glances of servants. She walked into the throne room with her head held high, her eyes fixed on a future only she could envision. No tears, no trembling lips, just a quiet determination. She listened as Tywin announced new measures for securing the North, for dividing its lands among the loyal. She stood by, outwardly passive as they discussed the fate of Winterfell, her ancestral seat. Every slight, every cold calculation she memorized. The Lannisters had sown the seeds of their own eventual downfall, she told herself. If they expected her to remain a docile prisoner, they had gravely underestimated the strength that loss had given her. Amid this new reality, she discovered an unlikely ally in Tyrion Lannister. He too harbored doubts about his family's methods and recognized the cruelty behind the Red Wedding. They never spoke openly about it, never named it for what it was, murder, but they shared a mutual understanding. Over cups of wine in his dim solar, they discussed the precariousness of power. She sought out his counsel about the mechanics of coin and trade. He marveled at her grasp of household management and her growing insights into politics. He once told her that knowledge was like a lamp in a dark place. The more you accumulate, the further you see. Sansa began gathering every scrap of knowledge she could find. She formed a secret alliance with a scribe who managed shipping manifests and discovered that certain merchant houses were funneling money into the treasury. She gleaned from passing conversation that the Iron Bank of Bravos had its own designs on Westeros, that gold was as potent a weapon as any sword. She realized that if she could direct the flow of coin, she might influence entire armies. And so she quietly began to cultivate friendships with merchants, tailors, ship captains, stable hands, anyone who might reveal something useful. She learned that people talked more freely if they believed you had no real power to harm them. Soon, Sansa Stark, the subdued northern maiden, had become the keeper of 1,000 hushed confidences. Every so often, Lord Tywin would inquire after her progress or invite her to speak with him about a small piece of business. He never acknowledged her grief, never apologized or justified his decisions. Instead, he treated her like a promising student. She answered him with perfect courtesy, carefully hiding her inner fury behind eyes that had learned not to weep. She suspected Tywin saw in her the same qualities that had made her father an able but ultimately doomed player of the game. Perhaps Tywin believed he could mold her into a valuable asset. She had no intention of remaining an asset, she would be an architect of her own fate. Joffrey's wedding to Margaery Tyrell arrived in a blaze of revelry. Sansa played her part, dressed in fine silks, bearing witness to the grand ceremony. She noted the tension between the Tyrells and the Lannisters, how each tried to outshine the other in displays of wealth and influence. She quietly stepped aside when Joffrey made a show of humiliating Tyrion. She sipped her wine and watched as the tapestry of alliances shifted. And when Joffrey choked and died, she felt a terrible swirl of emotions, relief, fear, confusion. That night, she felt no sorrow for the boy who had tormented her. Yet she was wise enough to keep her face expressionless, to feign shock alongside everyone else. In the ensuing chaos, Tywin tightened his grip on the realm. Tommen was crowned and the Tyrells moved quickly to secure a new marital bond. Cersei railed and wept, half-crazed with grief, demanding vengeance. Rumors spread that Tyrion was the poisoner. Sansa feigned ignorance, protesting that she knew nothing of the cup's contents or Joffrey's final words. Inside, she saw a window of opportunity. The capital reeled from the sudden death of its king. She could maneuver more freely now, perhaps even influence the direction of policy if she played her cards correctly. By the time Tyrion faced a trial for regicide, Sansa had cultivated enough personal relationships to ensure that her own name was kept out of suspicion. She visited him once before the trial began, slipping a note into his hand. It contained a few lines of advice, a subtle warning about certain judges who would be implacable. Tyrion's eyes flashed with gratitude and a hint of amusement. "Lady Sansa, I do believe you are wasted as a court ornament," he murmured. She merely nodded, a small, unreadable smile on her lips. When Oberyn Martell died in the trial by combat, tension soared. In the midst of the chaos, Sansa found herself approached by Cersei, whose eyes burned with a mixture of desperation and calculation. The queen demanded Sansa's loyalty, pressing her to denounce Tyrion, to declare him a monster who had threatened her. Sansa refused to lie openly. "I fear the gods more than men," she said demurely. Cersei bristled but could not force Sansa's cooperation without inciting Tywin's disapproval. In the end, Tyrion was convicted and sentenced to death. But he escaped with the help of Jaime Lannister. The city buzzed with speculation, but Sansa maintained her carefully poised role, neither mourning nor celebrating. In the aftermath of Tyrion's flight, Tywin was found murdered on the privy, felled by a quarrel from a crossbow. The shock rippled through King's Landing. Cersei ascended to the seat of power, but with her father gone, the underpinnings of Lannister authority were weakened. Forces gathered in the shadows, each vying to fill the vacuum. Spymasters, lords, and merchants scrambled for favor. Sansa realized that if she was to maintain her position and potentially rise higher, she would have to act decisively. She called upon her network of informants, forging alliances with minor nobles who had grown disenchanted with Lannister tyranny. She offered them assurances of future prosperity if they quietly supported her. She arranged for shipments of grain to be diverted from rebellious regions, ensuring that loyal towns prospered while traitorous enclaves starved. Little by little, she shaped the realm's fortunes from behind a veil of courtesy. She took advantage of Cersei's rash impulses, stoking her fears about the Tyrells or the Martells, subtly guiding the queen's anger toward easy targets. And when the chaos grew thick enough, Sansa would offer calm counsel, planting seeds of rational strategies that inevitably centered around her own influence. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. Some courtiers whispered that Sansa Stark had become the power behind the Boy King, the smiling rose with hidden thorns. Others called her cunning or unscrupulous. Sansa did not care. She had lost her family, seen her home plundered, endured humiliation. She refused to be a bystander any longer. If the Lannisters wanted her as an ally, she would be their ally, and she would bend them to her will, one subtle maneuver at a time. And so she stood again on the same balcony of the Red Keep where she had once felt so powerless, gazing upon the city that was now partly hers to command. Ships dotted Blackwater Bay, carrying goods from Essos, from the Reach, from Dorne. Down below, the city's people toiled and bargained, ignorant of how her hand guided certain fortunes. She felt a sense of grim satisfaction. She was no longer the wide-eyed girl from Winterfell. She was a political force, a woman shaped by grief and survival. And deep down, she still carried the name Stark, a name she did not intend to abandon or disgrace. She would build a new future in Westeros, a future that paid homage to her northern roots while acknowledging that power often required compromise. In the days to come, her name would echo through the Seven Kingdoms as a figure of both admiration and fear. Lords who once dismissed her as a pawn would come to realize that Sansa Stark had, in truth, become the one holding the strings. And in the quiet hours of night, she would remember her father's voice, her mother's kindness, her siblings' laughter, and wonder if they would recognize her now. Perhaps they would not, but she would continue on, for there was no other path forward, and she refused to let the Lannisters or any foe define her fate again. As the seasons turned and the small folk buzzed with rumors of White Walkers and dragons across the sea, Sansa Stark settled into her new reality of wielding influence from the shadows. King Tommen sat upon the Iron Throne, a boy king whose mild temperament made him easy prey for schemers and flatterers. The Tyrells believed themselves ascendant through Marjorie's hold on Tommen, yet they had never reckoned with the quiet evolution of Sansa Stark, the Northern Maiden who had learned the Lannisters' darkest arts. In the weeks after Tywin Lannister's death, Cersei struggled to maintain control. She dismissed men of honor and replaced them with sycophants. She became Hand of the King in all but name, her rulings harsh and erratic. Coin poured into the construction of a new fleet, even as King's Landing's poor cried out for bread. Sansa saw unrest brewing in the capital's slums. She also saw that Cersei was blind to it, so fixated was the queen on besting Margaery Tyrell and rooting out imaginary threats. Sansa's influence rested on subtlety. She did not proclaim new edicts, she whispered suggestions that others eagerly seized. A deal with certain Braavosi bankers here, a quiet arrangement with the master of coin there. The crown's finances were precarious, yet the Lannister gold mines were rumored to be running dry. Sansa turned her gaze outward, forging trade partnerships under Tommen's seal that brought silver and spices from the east. While the queen fought her social battles, Sansa built a financial bulwark that shored up the realm's coffers. True, some believed she was merely a figurehead, a tool of the more cunning lords. But in hushed chambers, the very lords who underestimated her found themselves cornered by her trade alliances and the quiet loyalty she fostered among the city's merchants. Bit by bit, she wove a tapestry of obligations and dependencies that stretched across the narrow sea and beyond. She maintained an outward posture of deference towards Cersei. When summoned to private audiences, Sansa bowed her head, gave succinct replies, and allowed the queen to believe that this once naive girl remained in awe of her power. Cersei reveled in her own authority, rarely suspecting that behind Sansa's folded hands and calm blue eyes lay a mind that had begun to think several moves ahead. Indeed, whenever Sansa's advice was asked, she made sure to present it in a way that would not trigger Cersei's pride. The queen would sometimes accept these suggestions, unaware that she was further entangling herself in Sansa's web. Then came the faith militant's resurgence, fueled by Cersei's attempt to humiliate Margaery by empowering the High Sparrow. The wave of zealotry that swept King's Landing, cloaked in piety and righteous anger, disrupted the tenuous balance of power. Men and women who had once turned a blind eye to the crown's excesses now took to the streets, demanding moral retribution. Cersei hoped that the faith would humble her rivals, but her gamble backfired spectacularly. Instead of forging a convenient alliance, she found herself at the mercy of the very forces she had unleashed. Sansa watched and waited. She had no desire to be paraded through the streets as Cersei would later be. Instead, she worked quietly with her merchant contacts and the Braavosi bankers to keep trade flowing, ensuring that when the faith seized some of Cersei's assets, alternate routes of revenue remained open under Sansa's control. She also maintained a careful relationship with Margaery Tyrell, offering the young queen consort little gestures of friendship, small gifts, kind words. Margaery, harried by the faith, accepted these gestures with cautious gratitude, perhaps sensing that Sansa was not her enemy. In truth, Sansa had no wish to see Margaery destroyed. She recognized a kindred spirit in the Tyrell Queen, another woman navigating the treacherous labyrinth of King's Landing. Together, if only temporarily, they could shield each other from the Queen Mother's paranoia. Yet Sansa never forgot that the Tyrells, too, had once raised arms against her brother. Alliances in Westeros were fickle. She would not place her trust blindly in Margaery or in any other house. Instead, she formed a small network of confidants. Some were scribes with access to sealed letters. Others were household knights, loyal not to the Lannisters but to the memory of Ned Stark's honor. She spent hours forging coded messages with a careful hand, reaching out to distant corners of the realm, planting seeds of influence that might one day bloom. Occasionally, she received tidings from the Vale, where Peter Baelish played his own game with young Lord Robin Arryn. She read each new letter from Peter with the same wary scrutiny. He offered her promises, spoke of potential marriage alliances and the future of the North. But Sansa had seen enough to know that Littlefinger's words were never free of self-interest. She responded politely, gleaning information while offering none of her own secrets in return. As the faith militant tightened its grip on King's Landing, unrest flared into violence. Riots broke out in Flea Bottom, stoked by rumors of royal corruption and immorality in the Red Keep. Crown Sparrows patrolled the streets, arresting sinners and handing out cruel judgments. The city lay under a pall of fear, and Cersei's hold on power began to slip. In a desperate attempt to maintain order, she doubled the city watch, draining the coffers even further. She tried to tighten her grip around Sansa but found that the Northern Maiden was elusive, her comings and goings shrouded by loyal servants. Whispers began that Sansa Stark was in league with the Faith, or perhaps was sowing chaos to undermine the Lannisters entirely. Sansa simply smiled when confronted by such rumors, for it served her purpose to remain an enigma, feared but not fully understood. In the midst of this turmoil, one bright spot stood out: Tommen's genuine affection for Sansa. The Boy King looked upon her as an older sister, perhaps even a mother figure, someone who offered calm reassurances without demanding anything in return. Sansa saw that Tommen longed for stability, for guidance that came without malice or manipulation. She provided it in small doses, always careful not to alienate the Tyrells or the Queen Mother. Through Tommen's trust, she gained the authority to issue certain decrees in the king's name. At first, these were minor, pardons for small crimes, exceptions for certain trade regulations. But as Tommen grew more reliant on her counsel, those minor decrees evolved into significant policies that shaped the distribution of the crown's resources. With each new measure, Sansa tightened her indirect hold over the realm's purse strings, ensuring that she could reward loyalty and starve opposition in subtle ways. All the while, she never revealed the full extent of her designs, not even to her handful of confidants. She had learned that in King's Landing, a secret shared was a weapon surrendered. Occasionally, she experienced pangs of conscience, recalling how she had once longed for a life of honesty and open-hearted friendship. But those times were gone. The memory of the Red Wedding, of her father's execution, of Joffrey's mockery remained seared into her soul. She carried the pain like a hidden blade. If she needed to be ruthless, she would be. The day arrived when the High Sparrow summoned both Cersei and Margaery for questioning, a brazen power move that signaled the Faith's new dominance in the city. Rumors flew. Some said that the High Sparrow intended to crown himself as a moral king of the realm. Others insisted that a purge of all sinful nobles was imminent. Sansa understood that the moment was ripe for a decisive shift. If she could further discredit Cersei in the eyes of the people, the Queen Mother's downfall would be all but sealed. Yet she also needed to ensure that the Faith did not turn its gaze upon her. She orchestrated quiet bribes to certain septas and sparrows, ensuring that no damaging information about her dealings would find its way to the pulpit. She let slip to a few well-placed ears that Cersei had once consorted with witchcraft, a rumor baseless enough to be easily denied, but tantalizing for a populace hungry for scandal. Then came the fateful day. Cersei was arrested and imprisoned by the Faith, charged with incest and other sins. The realm watched agape as the once mighty lioness found herself thrown into a cell. Margaery, too, was imprisoned, charged with lying about her brother's affairs. The capital descended into near chaos. Tommen retreated into himself, unable to save either his mother or his queen. The small council fractured under the pressure, various factions jostling for dominance. Sansa remained a steady presence at Tommen's side, consoling him, encouraging him to keep faith in the Seven. Quietly, she took on the responsibilities of governance, signing orders, and receiving audiences. To many, she appeared the most level-headed figure in the royal court, neither entangled in the Faith's web nor tainted by Cersei's misdeeds. In truth, Sansa found no joy in seeing another woman humiliated, no matter how cruel. But she acknowledged the necessity of this upheaval. With Cersei sidelined, she could maneuver unimpeded to reinforce her own power base. She secured alliances with southern lords who feared the Faith's overreach, promising them that Tommen's rule would be guided by wisdom and moderation so long as they pledged loyalty to the crown. She reached out to the Iron Bank, renegotiating debts and presenting a vision of a stable Westeros that would honor its financial obligations. Slowly, methodically, she positioned herself as the indispensable pillar holding the kingdom aloft. Her efforts culminated on the day Cersei was forced to walk naked through the streets of King's Landing, jeered by the very people she had once ruled. Sansa watched from a discreet vantage point, her hood drawn low. The spectacle was horrifying, a raw display of the city's collective rage. And though she might have felt a flicker of pity, she also recalled the day Joffrey had forced her to look upon her father's head on a spike. She remembered Cersei's cold smile then, her contempt. Whatever pity she felt was overshadowed by the awareness that this was the natural conclusion of Cersei's relentless cruelty. Vengeance in Westeros was never clean or noble. It was a grim cycle of brutality answering brutality. In the aftermath, Cersei returned to the Red Keep, shattered in spirit but still determined to cling to power. She found the castle greatly changed. The lords paramount who once trembled before Tywin now gravitated toward Tommen and those who guided him. The city guard held more loyalty to the crown's purse than to any single individual. And that purse in large part answered to Sansa's quiet administration. Even the servants seemed to regard Cersei with a certain wariness, no longer bowing with quite the same deference. A new tension descended upon the Red Keep. Cersei, stripped of her dignity, sought to regain control by any means necessary. She set spies to watch Sansa, determined to unearth the northern girl's secrets. Sansa, fully aware of these efforts, fed the Queen Mother a steady stream of innocuous falsehoods. She allowed Cersei's spies to glimpse her reading books about the history of Westeros or practicing needlework. She left letters in her drawer hinting at a mild romance with a fictional knight, complete with touching lines about love's purity. All of it was a performance, designed to further entrench the image of Sansa as a harmless dreamer who had stumbled into a position of influence by chance. Privately, however, she enhanced her communications with her northern contacts. She learned that Roose Bolton, now Warden of the North by royal decree, had his own difficulties controlling the northern lords loyal to the Starks. She learned that the Ironborn were in disarray after Balon Greyjoy's death, while Stannis Baratheon had marched north only to meet a grim fate in the snow. Amid this swirl of events, she recognized an opportunity to reassert some measure of Stark authority in the north. Yet to do so, she needed to maintain her standing in King's Landing long enough to shape events to her liking. When the time came for Tommen to address the realm's financial crises, it was Sansa who penned the royal proclamations. When rebellious houses in the Stormlands refused to send taxes, she personally negotiated terms to keep them in the fold. In each decision, she subtly inserted clauses that favored future reconciliation with northern houses. She would, for instance, reduce tariffs on fur and timber from the north, encouraging trade routes that benefited Winterfell. She recognized that this might seem small in the grand scheme, but 1,000 small concessions could pave the way for a grand restoration. Cersei seethed. She sensed her power slipping through her fingers. Tommen hardly listened to his mother anymore, turning instead to Sansa and the small council for guidance. Marjorie, newly freed and eager to regain her place at court, found herself marginally outmaneuvered by Sansa's patience and planning. Even Kevan Lannister, who stepped in to stabilize the situation, found it wiser to cooperate with Sansa than to confront her. She was, after all, the best shield the crown had against the wrath of both the High Sparrow and the rebellious lords. The more the realm stabilized under Sansa's quiet stewardship, the less anyone dared to dislodge her. Yet for all her successes, Sansa was no stranger to doubt. Late at night, she would stand by her window overlooking the dark waters of Blackwater Bay, recalling Winterfell's crisp air and the howling of direwolves. She remembered Arya's fierce eyes, Bran's laughter, Rickon's tiny hand in hers. Had she betrayed them by forging alliances with the Lannisters? Or was she honoring them by ensuring that House Stark would not be forgotten, that its lineage might one day reclaim its place without another blood-soaked tragedy? She had not become a monster, she told herself, but a survivor. The line between the two often blurred in Westeros. She found herself confiding in no one, for who could understand the weight she carried? Perhaps Tyrion might have, but Tyrion was gone, vanished across the narrow sea. Lady Brienne had once sworn to protect her, but now served in the north, rumored to be aiding her sister. And the ghosts of her family offered little more than distant echoes. So she walked alone down the torchlit corridors of the Red Keep, each footstep an affirmation of her chosen path. Her moment of reckoning arrived unexpectedly. A raven from the north brought urgent news. Ramsay Bolton had disappeared after a skirmish with unknown forces near Winterfell. Some said the Boltons had fallen into disfavor with the crown. Others whispered of an uprising led by northern clans loyal to the Starks. The letter was not entirely clear on the details, but it spoke of chaos in the Dreadfort and uncertainty about who now held Winterfell. The north was in turmoil, and the lords of the Vale were considering an intervention. Peter Baelish had evidently gained support for a march north, claiming he would restore order in Sansa's name. Cersei found the news vexing but saw no immediate benefit in interfering. The Queen Mother scoffed at the idea that Sansa Stark might have any real claim to the north. She remained mired in her own struggles, locked in a power dance with the Faith and the Tyrells. But Sansa recognized the fragility of the moment. If Littlefinger gained control of Winterfell, it would be nearly impossible to pry it from his grasp without open conflict. The North, wounded and leaderless, might bend to a manipulator's will unless Sansa acted. She realized that her chance to reclaim her heritage was now, but she needed the resources of King's Landing, the legitimacy of Tommen's royal seal, and the alliances she had so carefully cultivated. Summoning her closest confidants, she devised a bold plan. First, she sought Tommen's blessing to travel north under the crown's banner to negotiate peace and ensure that royal decrees were upheld. Tommen, timid but eager to maintain stability, gave his consent, especially after Sansa assured him that her goal was to prevent further bloodshed among his northern subjects. Officially, she would be the king's envoy tasked with restoring order. Unofficially, she would pursue the resurgence of House Stark, forging alliances with loyal bannermen to edge out both the Boltons and Littlefinger. Of course, leaving King's Landing posed risks. She would be away from her established networks, more vulnerable to sabotage. Cersei could seize the opportunity to undermine her position at court or worse, arrange some deadly accident on the road. To counter this, Sansa made sure to finalize key financial measures before she departed. Measures that placed large portions of the crown's funds under the stewardship of men loyal to her. She also enlisted the support of certain Sellsword companies, promising them future contracts if they safeguarded her journey. She left behind a network of informants who would alert her to any sudden moves from Cersei or the Tyrells. And to seal her departure with a touch of ceremony, she requested a formal farewell from the throne, ensuring that the whole city saw Tommen publicly endorsing her mission. When the day came for her departure, Sansa felt a strange blend of excitement and trepidation. She donned a gown of rich burgundy trimmed with northern fur, a subtle reminder of her heritage. The city guard lined the streets as she rode through the gate. Some small folk cheered, having grown accustomed to seeing her as the calming presence behind the boy king. Others looked on with suspicion, wondering what new scheme was afoot. She kept her expression serene, her posture straight. Within her carriage rode chests filled with official decrees, gold, and gifts for the northern lords. Behind her followed a modest retinue of guards and servants, just enough to show dignity without provoking the Faith or the Tyrells into thinking she was raising a private army. As she passed through the outer walls of King's Landing, she glanced back at the Red Keep's towers. That fortress of deception and blood had been her prison, her school, and her stage. She had endured horrors within its walls, but also honed her wits to a fine edge. Now she left it behind with the blessings of a king, albeit a boy king. Part of her wondered if she would ever see it again. If she succeeded in the north, perhaps she might reshape the realm entirely, forging a new era where Starks and Lannisters did not have to live in perpetual enmity. The journey northward was fraught with tension. Rumors of bandits roving the war-torn countryside reached her ears daily. The remnants of the War of the Five Kings still scarred the land. Small villages lay abandoned or burnt out, their people scattered. Soldiers loyal to no one but themselves occasionally demanded tolls on the King's Road. Yet Sansa's retinue was well-armed and carried royal seals of safe passage. Several times, groups of armed men approached, only to bow and step aside when they recognized the king's banner. The memory of Tywin's merciless retribution still loomed, and few dared to provoke what appeared to be royal authority. Upon reaching Moat Cailin, the ancient southern gate of the north, Sansa felt an unfamiliar stirring in her chest, a sense of belonging. The marshes and misty landscape reminded her of childhood tales of a homeland she had lost but never forgotten. Here, the wind carried a chill that felt almost comforting. She was among her own people, though whether they still considered her their own was another matter. Word of her approach spread quickly among the northern lords. Some welcomed her with guarded respect, recalling the honor of House Stark. Others viewed her as a traitor who had aligned with the Lannisters. A few openly questioned her motives, muttering about the presence of gold cloaks in her entourage. Sansa did not flinch under their scrutiny. She convened a gathering of northern lords in the old halls of Moat Cailin, using the authority given her by Tommen's decree. She spoke with measured grace, acknowledging the tragedies that had befallen the North: her father's execution, Robb's death, the Boltons' tyranny. She declared her desire to restore stability and justice, emphasizing that she acted in the name of the king but also as a daughter of House Stark. She offered pardons for past rebellions, shipments of grain and supplies to see them through the harsh winter. The crown wishes to heal, not harm, she said, her voice echoing through the cold stone. But it can only do so if we stand together. Some lords accepted her words, attracted by the promise of material aid. Others remained skeptical. Lord Manderley of White Harbor, in particular, pressed her on her true loyalty. Will you truly restore Stark rule to the north, or have you come to bury it once and for all? He demanded, his voice heavy with the weight of old loyalties and bitter betrayal. Sansa replied with a calm certainty that she was here to see House Stark rise again, not to subjugate her homeland under a southern heel. She did not speak openly of reclaiming Winterfell for herself, at least not yet. She knew that the next steps would involve delicate negotiations, forging alliances strong enough to counter not only the Boltons but also Baelish's forces if they arrived. Meanwhile, disturbing tales reached her ears, rumors of an army of the dead marching beyond the wall, of dire omens seen by rangers of the Night's Watch. Sansa dismissed these stories at first, recalling how wild rumors often circulated in times of chaos. But the frequency of the reports unnerved her. The North had always been closer to the old magic, to forces that the South scoffed at. If even a fraction of these rumors were true, her entire plan to stabilize the region might be undone by a threat no political maneuver could fully contain. She pressed on, determined to secure Winterfell before Baish could weave his spells of deception. Ravaged by conflict and rumored to be partially in ruins, Winterfell nonetheless held an undeniable power as the seat of the North. If she could claim it under royal sanction, if she could rally the Northern lords around her, then House Stark would be more than just a memory. Her retinue advanced cautiously, aware that the Boltons might still have men lurking in the countryside. When at last the gray towers of Winterfell rose above the horizon, Sansa felt tears prick at her eyes. Memories flooded back. Running through the courtyard with Arya, listening to old Nan's stories by the hearth, her father smiling from a balcony. The castle looked weary, its walls scorched and gates mended hastily. Snow dusted the battlements. A hush fell over her party as they approached. No banners flew above the gates. No guards hailed them. It was as if the old fortress had become a ghost of itself. Inside, they found a handful of servants and soldiers, leaderless and fearful. The news of Ramsay Bolton's disappearance had left Winterfell in limbo. Some suspected he might return, others hoped he was dead. Sansa wasted no time in establishing order. She presented Tommen's decree, asserting royal authority over the castle, promising the men fair treatment if they laid down their arms. Most complied without resistance. Those who hesitated were offered a choice: swear loyalty to House Stark and the crown, or face the consequences of open defiance. Only a few souls refused, and they were swiftly disarmed. No blood was shed. That evening, by torchlight in the Great Hall, Sansa Stark walked across the cold stone floor toward the ancient high seat of the Starks. She ran her fingers along the carved direwolves etched into the wood. 1,000 memories and ghosts lingered here, whispering of ancient battles, alliances, and betrayals. She felt the weight of her family's legacy like a cloak of ice. Slowly, she sat down, her posture regal, her expression composed. Men and women gathered before her, some kneeling in tentative recognition of her authority. The North had been broken, betrayed, and brutalized, but in that moment, a spark of its old spirit flickered back to life. "Winterfell belongs to House Stark," she said, her voice carrying the echo of ages. "We have endured tragedy and treachery, but the blood of the first men runs strong in our veins. I claim this seat, not for the Lannisters, not for those who preyed upon us, but for the North. Under the protection of the crown, yes, but first and foremost for the people who have bled on this land." A hush settled. Lord Manderly stepped forward, then bent the knee. Others followed, though some did so grudgingly. For better or worse, Sansa had reclaimed Winterfell without battle. Whether the Northern lords accepted her as a true Stark or saw her as a royal puppet would depend on the steps she took next. But she had taken the first bold stride toward restoring her family's legacy. Outside, the wind howled across the snow-covered courtyard. Winter was upon them, yet a faint sense of hope stirred in the hearts of those who had lived under the Boltons' cruelty. They dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, the winter might not be so harsh if guided by a Stark's hand. And Sansa, sitting upon her family's seat, felt a swell of resolve. She had navigated the lion's den, made alliances with those who had once been her enemies, and shaped the politics of the realm to forge this opportunity. Now, the real test began. She gazed at the flickering torches, at the drawn faces of weary men, and she thought of the road that had led her here. She had wielded cunning and deception, had traded in secrets and alliances, had walked a razor's edge of loyalty and ambition. That path had stained her hands, cost her innocence, and burdened her soul. But for the sake of Winterfell, for the memory of her father and brothers, she would bear that burden. She would do whatever it took to ensure that the North would never again bow to a butcher's whim, nor dance to the tune of far-off kings who cared nothing for the old ways. Whether the future held victory or doom, only time would tell. For now, she had seized her destiny from the jaws of the lion, and she intended to shape it into something worthy of the Stark name. In the dim torchlight of the great hall, the direwolf sigil cast long shadows on the walls as if to silently approve of its daughter's return. Sansa Stark straightened her shoulders and began issuing commands. Winterfell would rise again, under the banner of a young woman who had weathered the storm of Lannister politics to emerge a player in her own right, a player who now held the fate of the North in her hands. Sansa woke the next morning to a thin film of snow blanketing the courtyard. The skies were gray and an early winter wind whistled through the open windows of the great keep. She rose from the old canopied bed that once belonged to her parents, the bed where she had slept as a child in the happier days before all the horrors began. The room felt foreign yet comfortingly familiar. Gone were the southern silks and polished marble floors of King's Landing, replaced by rough-hewn walls hung with faded banners of House Stark. Though the keep lacked the splendor of the Red Keep, Sansa felt an odd relief in its darkness. This was her home, and she was finally here, no longer a child, no longer a helpless pawn. She wrapped herself in a cloak of dark wool trimmed with the pelts of mountain hares. The cold pinched her cheeks, reminding her that, in the north, winter was not merely a season but a constant presence, an identity. She stood by the window and gazed out at the courtyard below where the night's snowfall was already trampled by the boots of guards and servants. The main gates stood open, flanked by men bearing the sigil of House Stark, her sigil. To see it displayed openly again stirred something deep within her. She had promised the North that House Stark would rise anew, and she intended to keep that promise. In the hallways, her footfalls echoed. Each stone seemed to hold a memory, the laughter of her siblings, the stern commands of her father, the steady presence of her mother. She let herself imagine, just for a moment, that they were all still here. But those illusions melted quickly. So many were dead: Robb, Catelyn, even the courtiers who once sang in these corridors. She hardened herself against that ache. Mourn later, she told herself. For now, there was work to be done. She summoned her advisors, those who had followed her from King's Landing, along with the local stewards and men-at-arms who had served under the Boltons or who had hidden in the hills until the Boltons fled. A handful of northern lords, including Lord Manderley and Lady Barbary Dustin, were expected to convene in the Great Hall later that day. The threat of Peter Baelish loomed. Rumors suggested he was riding north with the Knights of the Vale, proclaiming he wished to restore order in Sansa's name. On any other day, she might have laughed at that. Baelish claiming to do anything in someone else's name was folly. But she knew he was dangerous, perhaps the single most dangerous player in the game. He had a knack for turning the illusions of others into stepping stones for his own ambition. A young steward named Willis guided her through Winterfell's ledgers, explaining what had happened under the Boltons' short reign. Many of the old staff had fled or been cast out. Stores of grain and salted meats were lower than she'd hoped, though not disastrously so. The armory was half-stocked, the stables in need of repair. Repairs, in general, were needed everywhere: crumbling walls, scorched ramparts, collapsed roofs where fires had raged during the battles. Sansa listened with careful attention, making mental notes of each shortfall. Beyond the gates, there were entire villages in need of food and shelter for the winter. She could not sit idle while children starved in her name. She composed lists and instructions, ensuring immediate steps were taken to distribute rations and hire laborers for vital repairs. The silver she had brought from King's Landing was doled out in measured allotments, payments for carpenters, blacksmiths, and hunters who could bring in game. It would not solve all problems, but it was a beginning. She felt the weight of Tommen's royal decree in her pocket. It legitimized her authority to act as an envoy of the crown, to make decisions on the king's behalf, but she knew that alone would not win the hearts of the people. Deeds would matter far more than parchment. She set aside time to walk the grounds, to speak directly with the guards, the stable hands, the cooks. If they were shocked to see their new Lady of Winterfell speaking to them so freely, they hid it well. Some recognized her as the daughter of Ned Stark, that memory alone softening their wariness. Others viewed her with caution, uncertain how much she had been tainted by her time among the Lannisters. She did her best to show them kindness, to let them see that she was not here to replace one cruel ruler with another. Yet she could not deny that the cunning she had learned in King's Landing still guided her, shaping every smile, every gentle word. She was two people now, the Stark girl she had once been and the strategist she had become. By midday, the great hall was warm with crackling hearth fires. Lords and ladies arrived in small retinues, some wearing wool cloaks in the deep blues of House Serwyn or the gold and white of House Manderley, others wrapped in the green of House Glover or the dark browns of minor vassal houses. A dozen houses, great and small, heeded her summons. Their voices filled the hall in a low rumble of tension and curiosity. The image of a Bolton flayed man was nowhere to be seen. Instead, stark banners draped the walls as of old. Yet those banners, once a source of comfort, now presided over an uneasy gathering. Sansa made her entrance from the side doors, dressed in gray wool and silver clasps shaped like dire wolf heads. Her hair was braided in a northern style, pinned back from her face. She could feel their gazes upon her, some openly studying her, others pretending indifference. She took her seat at the raised dais where once her father had passed judgment. A hush fell as she gestured for the assembled lords and ladies to be seated on the benches below. "Lords and ladies of the North," Sansa began, projecting a clear voice. "I welcome you back to Winterfell. I know these times have been cruel. We have lost too many to war, betrayal, and hunger. Our fields are scorched, our villages abandoned. But today I ask you to look around and see that despite all, we still stand." She let her gaze sweep over them. Lord Wyman Manderley watched her with a shrewd, expectant expression. Lady Barbary Dustin kept her chin lifted, her dark eyes guarded. Representatives from smaller houses, Tallheart, Serwyn, Flint, shifted uncomfortably, uncertain of what to expect from this newly returned Stark. "We have endured tragedies," Sansa continued. "I know some of you feared that House Stark was lost. But I have returned, not to claim your allegiance by force or fear. I come with the blessing of King Tommen Baratheon, who wishes peace in the North. More importantly, I come as a daughter of Ned Stark. My father believed that the North thrives when we stand as one, when we protect our own. I intend to see that the North is restored, not by gold alone, but by justice and unity." A murmuring rose among the gathered. Some nodded gravely while others exchanged doubtful glances. Lady Dustin's lip curled slightly as if uncertain whether to believe in the sincerity of these words. Sansa pressed on, determined to prove she was no mere figurehead. She spoke of a plan to organize relief efforts in the hardest-hit regions, to rebuild roads and fortifications, to re-establish alliances between houses that had been fractured by war. She offered partial pardons on taxes to those who had lost lands, balancing that with an increased levy on the more prosperous enclaves. She promised that the crown's coin, which she controlled as Tommen's envoy, would be used to rebuild the burnt villages around Winterfell first. That would encourage trade routes to open again, benefiting all. It was a calculated approach, one that might calm the fear that she was simply a Lannister puppet. She held nothing back about the rumors of Peter Baelish's approach. "Lord Baelish professes he will come to restore order," she announced. "But we know well the ways of those who swoop in when others are weakest. If the North can unite, if we can mend our wounds ourselves, we shall not need an outsider to dictate our fate." That last remark earned a round of nods. Baelish was a Southerner in the eyes of most Northerners, a cunning manipulator from the Vale. None present wanted him as an overlord. By naming him directly, Sansa framed him as a common threat. Yet she did not speak words of open hostility or vow to turn him away by force. Instead, she let them wonder about her next move. Many of these lords remembered how Lord Baelish had seized power in the Vale. Rumor told of how he had married Lady Lisa Arryn only for her to die in suspicious circumstances soon after. If Sansa could quietly suggest that the same brand of opportunism threatened the North, she might rally them behind her. Lord Manderley stood up, his great girth making him appear even more imposing as he rose to speak. "Lady Sansa," he rumbled, "you speak well of unity and healing. We all wish for the North to recover from these horrors. But we have heard rumors that men of the Lannister Guard accompanied you here. Some say the Lannisters still hold your loyalty more than the wolves of the North. Will you grant us your word that this is not so, that you stand for the Starks above all?" All eyes turned to her again. Sansa lifted her chin, resolved not to show offense. "Yes, I traveled under the banner of King Tommen. Without his royal decree, the Boltons would have found reason to label me a rebel. I needed the shield to return home safely. But I tell you plainly now, my loyalty is to this land, to Winterfell. Had I remained in King's Landing, I would be at the mercy of those who orchestrated the destruction of my family. Instead, I choose to stand here with you. It is by my own power and the goodwill of our rightful king that I have come. And if you doubt me, you need only watch what I do in the days and weeks to come. Judge me by my deeds as my father would have wished." A hush of consideration followed. Manderley bowed his head slightly, signaling he would give her the benefit of the doubt. Others muttered among themselves, but no one voiced outright dissent. A tenuous acceptance, Sansa knew, but acceptance nonetheless. After the gathering dispersed, she found herself exhausted. She retreated to her father's solar, where she once had sat as a child while he worked through ledgers and read dispatches from across the North. The room was cold, the shutters rattling. She lit a few candles and sank onto a wooden chair, staring at the great oaken desk still engraved with the Stark direwolf. Her father's memory was thick in the air, and she closed her eyes for a moment, recalling the warmth of his hand on her hair, his gentle voice telling her that one day she would be a lady who ruled her own household. He had never imagined it would be under such grim circumstances, or that she would have to blend the cunning she'd learned in the South with the stoic resilience of the North. Her reverie was broken by the sound of footsteps. She opened her eyes to see Brienne of Tarth standing at the threshold. Sansa felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief, surprise, and a pang of guilt. Brienne had once offered her protection on behalf of her mother, but Sansa had been too fearful to trust her at that time. Now here the knight stood, tall and unyielding, with eyes full of concern. "My lady," Brienne said, dipping her head in a show of respect. "I arrived just after your council meeting. The roads from the wall have been treacherous, and I came as soon as I heard you had returned." Sansa rose and crossed the room, hesitating only an instant before embracing Brienne. The knight stiffened at first, but then gently placed a hand on Sansa's back. "I'm glad you are well, Lady Sansa," Brienne murmured. Sansa stepped back, trying to compose herself. "I should have trusted you sooner," she said quietly. "You were always true to your vow. I was simply afraid. Everything that happened in King's Landing, I had no idea who to trust." Brienne shook her head. "I understand. The world has not been kind to you. But I swore an oath to your mother, Lady Catelyn, and that oath remains. I am here to serve and protect you, if you will have me." Sansa nodded, her throat tightening with gratitude. Here stood someone whose loyalty was not a product of manipulation or cunning. "I welcome it," she said softly. "So much has changed, but I remember your courage at the inn that night, how you tried to help. I remember it now more clearly than ever." Brienne's posture relaxed slightly. "I only hope I can be of use. I have heard troubling news about the Boltons, about Lord Baish, and about other threats." Sansa gestured for her to sit, and they talked long into the evening. Brienne brought news of the wall, rumors that the Night's Watch was in upheaval, that wildlings had been allowed to cross south by Jon Snow, recently chosen Lord Commander. Sansa's heart twisted at the mention of Jon. She had rarely thought of him in her younger days, dismissing him as her illegitimate half-brother. But now his name carried new weight. If the rumors were true, he might be forging alliances with the free folk in order to defend against a greater threat. Brienne spoke carefully of talk she had heard, talk of White Walkers, of whites. Most of the realm scoffed at these stories, but some at the wall believed them wholeheartedly. Sansa felt an uneasy chill pass through her. Everything was shifting, as though the old rules no longer applied. "I've also heard that Lord Stannis fell in battle against the Boltons," Brienne said, her voice softening. "Some say he was slain, others that he was taken. I do not know the truth of it. If the Boltons truly are broken, then the North is free of their cruelty, but it also means chaos. The path for Lord Baish might be wide open if we do not act swiftly." Sansa nodded, taking it all in. "I have begun to rally the North to restore faith in House Stark," she replied. "I need to gather every house I can. If Baish arrives with the Knights of the Vale and claims to fight on my behalf, some will flock to his banner. My father once said that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. I will not let Baish save me only to keep the North under his thumb. We must be prepared to counter him." In the following days, Brienne's arrival did much to bolster Sansa's authority. Here was a knight of unwavering honor, known to have served Lady Catelyn Stark and to have defied the Lannisters more than once. Her presence underlined that Sansa was not merely a Lannister puppet. It reassured those who still doubted. Lady Dustin, wary though she remained, softened her harsh stance. Lord Manderly openly approved, calling Brienne a symbol of knightly virtue in an unknightly time. Sansa seized that momentum. Letters went out from Winterfell to every corner of the North. Formal invitations for lords to bring their grievances, to speak of how the crown could ease their burdens. Traveling messengers were dispatched to the more distant keeps. Some carried tokens of goodwill, coin to help with rebuilding, or shipments of grain. Others bore pleas for the lords to unite against any outside interference. Always, Sansa signed her letters with two seals, the direwolf of House Stark and the crown sigil that Tommen had granted her. Let the lords see that she held power from both traditions. As winter's chill deepened, the prospect of Baelish's army approaching loomed heavier. The north was vast, so scouts were sent to watch the roads leading from the Bloody Gate in the Vale. Little news came at first, only sightings of small mounted parties. Then a sealed message arrived by Raven addressed to Sansa personally. She recognized Baelish's tidy handwriting. In elegant phrasing, he proclaimed himself relieved to hear she was safe at Winterfell and that he was writing to assist her in fortifying her ancestral seat. He implied that he had ties to certain northern houses that might prove beneficial, that he could secure the resources she needed. Not once did he mention that Sansa had never asked for such aid. She could almost hear his sly tone beneath the flowery words. He was making sure that if she refused him, he could accuse her of turning away his generosity. If she accepted, he would claim he was her rightful protector. Sansa read the letter twice, then slid it into the flames of the hearth in her solar. She watched the parchment blacken and curl, sending up a thin wisp of smoke that vanished into the cold air. Brienne stood near the door, quietly observing. "So he makes his move," she commented. "Yes," Sansa said calmly. "He thinks I'm still the girl who believed his every lie. Perhaps once I was, but no longer." She paused, considering the next step. "We need a plan for when he arrives. He might bring a sizable force of knights from the Vale, and some northern houses might be tempted by the promise of his gold. We have the crown's coin, but he is cunning beyond measure." Brienne's voice was firm. "We can prepare our own defenders, gather those loyal to House Stark. If you stand strong, many in the north will rally to you rather than bend the knee to a Vale lord." Sansa nodded. "I will do that. But we must be careful not to appear as though we are defying the crown. If the Vale proclaims that I am in danger, the Lannisters might see reason to intervene. I don't want to give Cersei or any of them an excuse to send soldiers north again." So began the flurry of preparations. Winterfell's walls were repaired, watchtowers manned day and night. Sansa's small retinue of Lannister guards, men who had once sworn to keep her safe, were politely asked to work alongside northern men. The Southerners squirmed under the watchful gazes of the locals but complied under her command. Most recognized that defying the Lady of Winterfell so openly would end badly. Ser Balman, the highest-ranked knight among them, protested at first that the men of the north should be subordinate to the crown's soldiers. Sansa gently but firmly reminded him that Winterfell was a hold of the Starks, not the Lannisters. Ser Balman's eyes flickered with resentment, but he did not openly defy her. She sensed that he might eventually become a problem, but for now he followed orders. As the days passed, more northern lords trickled in, some with small entourages, others with only a couple of riders. Lord Serwyn pledged 100 men to defend Winterfell from any external threat. The Flints of Widow's Watch sent an emissary who offered scouts. House Glover, battered by the wars, provided precious materials from their forests. Sansa greeted each new arrival with calm courtesy. In truth, she felt relief that they were responding to her calls at all. Every new vow of fealty was a small victory, though part of her remained painfully aware that some were simply hedging bets, waiting to see who emerged with the upper hand. Winter settled in earnest now. Snow piled around the outer walls and the days grew shorter. Sansa instituted rationing for the castle stores, mindful that the winter was likely to be long. Lines of small folk arrived seeking shelter, many having lost their homes to Bolton marauders or bandits. She ordered that makeshift shelters be erected within Winterfell's courtyard and along the inner ward. A portion of the crown's coin she had brought was put toward feeding these refugees. Some lords might have balked at the expense, but Sansa remembered her father's lessons about caring for one's own people, especially in harsh times. She knew each act of kindness would strengthen the North's faith in her. More importantly, it was the right thing to do. Word arrived one evening that Peter Baelish had reached the outskirts of Moat Cailin with a host of Vale Knights. A storm had delayed him, but now he was moving cautiously up the King's Road, apparently mindful of ambushes or opportunistic bandits. Sansa dispatched a pair of messengers to greet him, both carefully instructed to observe his numbers and glean any hint of his intentions. She also sent word to the nearest loyal houses, urging them to stand by for further instructions. If Baelish expected to stroll unchallenged into the seat of the Starks, he would find himself mistaken. On the third day after that, a rider galloped into the courtyard, covered in sweat despite the frigid weather, calling out that Lord Baelish's party had reached the last river crossing. By the rider's estimation, Baelish would arrive at Winterfell's gates before nightfall. Sansa readied herself, dressing in a heavy gown of gray and white, with the Stark dire wolf embroidered along the sleeves. She took a seat in the great hall, flanked by Lord Manderley and Lady Dustin, with Brienne standing behind her chair. A retinue of guards lined the walls, all wearing the Stark badge. She wanted to present a united front. not the meek girl Baelish remembered. True to the messenger's word, Baelish arrived as dusk settled. The doors opened, letting in a swirl of snow and a procession of Vale knights in gleaming armor. Behind them, Peter Baelish entered with his usual grace, wearing a fine cloak of sable fur over a dark doublet. He swept a courteous bow in Sansa's direction, eyes glittering with the same cool cunning she remembered from King's Landing. "My lady," he said, his voice gentle yet carrying easily through the hall. "It warms my heart to see you here, safe and enthroned in your rightful home." Sansa gave a faint, polite smile. "Lord Baelish, we bid you welcome to Winterfell, though the road must have been harsh." Baelish straightened, letting his gaze flick around the hall. "The road was indeed perilous, but I could not in good conscience leave my dear lady unprotected, especially with so many threats lurking in these troubled times." Sansa forced herself not to scoff. "We are grateful for your concern," she replied evenly. "Though you see, the North stands with me. I have loyal supporters, and the castle is secure." Baelish feigned a surprised look, as though he had never doubted her. "Of course, my lady. I expected nothing less from Ned Stark's daughter. Still, I bring good tidings from the Vale. Lord Robin Arryn has sent these knights to ensure no harm befalls his cousin." Some of the northern lords shifted uneasily. The sight of well-trained, disciplined knights in polished plate armor was an imposing reminder of the Vale's might. Baelish gestured to them with a small flourish, as though presenting a gift. "They are at your disposal, my lady, if you desire them." Sansa maintained her composure. "Your generosity is noted, but please sit and rest. You must be weary from the journey." She ordered that food and drink be brought out, though the winter fare was simpler than what Baelish might have been accustomed to in the warmer south. The Vale knights stood at attention near the hall's entrance, while Baelish accepted a cup of mulled wine. He sipped slowly, his eyes never leaving her. At last he spoke again, so softly that only those closest could hear. "It pleases me to see you well, my lady. We have much to discuss, do we not?" Sansa inclined her head. "We do, but those discussions can wait until tomorrow. You and your men are welcome to stay here tonight. My stewards will show you to suitable quarters." The tension in the hall was thick as Baelish bowed once more and departed with his retinue. Only after he was gone did Sansa allow herself a weary exhale. Lord Manderley leaned over, speaking in a low rumble. "He is a snake, my lady. A cunning one at that." She nodded. "Yes, but for now we must keep him close. The alternative might be giving him free rein to plot behind our backs." That night, the wind howled outside Winterfell's walls and Sansa slept only fitfully. She dreamed of a labyrinthine corridor twisting beneath the Red Keep, with Baelish whispering half-truths in one ear and Cersei's mocking laughter echoing in the distance. She saw her father's face, then Robb's, then her mother's. Each of them vanished into the darkness, leaving her alone. She woke with her heart pounding, the taste of fear bitter on her tongue. For a moment, she felt the old urge to hide, to let someone else solve these problems. But that girl no longer existed. Sansa Stark had learned that to shape her own destiny, she must face her enemies head-on, even if they came under the guise of concerned friends. In the morning, she summoned Baelish to her solar. He arrived with a carefully composed expression, stepping inside with that slight, knowing smile. "My lady," he greeted, closing the door behind him, "it has been far too long since we last spoke without the press of courtiers." Sansa watched him carefully. "Indeed, Lord Baelish, a world has changed in that time." He inclined his head as though to express sympathy. "My heart wept for your losses. Your mother, your brother, such tragedies. And how you suffered in King's Landing. If only I could have intervened sooner." She remembered all too well how he had arranged her escape from King's Landing after Joffrey's death, only to deliver her to the Eyrie and a new set of schemes. "Yet here we are," she replied. "You have come a long way, Lord Baelish. I do wonder, what do you hope to gain from your presence in Winterfell?" He let out a soft chuckle. "Straight to the point. I admire your frankness, my lady. The truth is, I have always taken an interest in your well-being. You are the daughter of Catelyn Tully, a woman who once graced my life with her kindness. When I learned you had reclaimed your rightful seat, I felt compelled to offer my assistance." He held her gaze as if to see if she might crack. "I have wealth, influence, knights, all things you may require to keep the North safe from those who might undermine you. Sansa's response was measured. And in return? You must want something. Loyalty, perhaps, he said, feigning humility. A bond between Winterfell and the Vale, secured by mutual respect. I am aware that the North has been ravaged by war and the Vale remains relatively untouched. My knights are well rested, well provisioned. If the North were to face another threat, say, an incursion from across the sea or from the Iron Islands, it would help to have allies strong enough to respond. She regarded him for a long moment. Your offer is tempting, but I must protect the North from more than just external threats. We both know there are men who would seize any chance to rule here. Baish spread his hands. I desire no crown, my lady. My birth was too low for that. I only wish to ensure that you have the support you need. Your father once said, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Let me help you build a pack that no southern force can threaten. Sansa allowed a thoughtful silence to linger. She recalled how Baish had manipulated the lords of the Vale to do his bidding, how he had orchestrated Lisa Arryn's downfall. Yet she also knew that refusing him outright could spur him into more covert sabotage. She needed to keep him in her sight to gauge his intentions at every step. For now, she said evenly, your knights may remain in Winterfell. But they will follow my commands or the commands of my chosen officers, not yours. We will see how well we can cooperate in the days ahead. A flicker of something annoyance perhaps passed across Baelish's face, but he quickly masked it with a courteous nod. Of course, my lady. I submit to your wishes in all things. She doubted that was true, but let it pass. Very well. I also ask that you refrain from any independent negotiations with the North's lords without my approval. We stand as one or not at all. Baish bowed, offering a thin-lipped smile. As you say, Lady Stark, my gratitude for your hospitality. When he was gone, the space he had occupied felt colder, as though his presence had drained the room of warmth. Sansa gazed out the window at the courtyard below where Vale Knights drilled alongside northern soldiers under Brienne's supervision. On the surface, it looked like a display of unity. But she knew that one misstep could turn them against each other. Baish had sown chaos wherever he went. She intended to remain vigilant. In the days that followed, a tense rhythm settled over Winterfell. Baish took up a suite of rooms in one of the towers, receiving visitors in a manner that made Sansa uneasy. She could not prevent the northern lords from speaking to him if they wished, yet she tried to keep a watchful eye. Whenever she heard of a private conversation, she casually summoned that lord later to discuss pressing matters, carefully gauging if Baish had spread any poison in their ears. So far, she saw no open signs of treachery, yet her instincts warned her it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, a more urgent concern began to press upon them, reports of roving bandits near Long Lake and scattered sightings of strange figures in the night far to the north. Some whispered of ice-blue eyes in the darkness, of dead men walking. Others dismissed these tales as the ravings of frightened peasants. Lady Dustin scoffed, insisting the real dangers were the Ironborn or perhaps the broken remnants of the Bolton forces. But Brienne reminded Sansa of what she had heard at the Wall, that the dead were no mere folktale. Sansa ordered scouts to patrol north of Winterfell, offering double pay to any who brought back verifiable news. She also sent a raven to Castle Black, requesting information from Jon Snow if he would deign to answer her. She hesitated over how to address him. Should she call him her half-brother or Lord Commander? In the end, she simply wrote, to Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, from Sansa Stark of Winterfell. Days stretched into a week, and tension continued to build. The bleak skies and growing snowdrifts reminded them that the season could not be escaped. Under the surface, alliances were forming and breaking in small ways. Lord Serwyn seemed intrigued by Baelish's promises of trade routes through Gulltown. House Glover remained firmly in Sansa's corner, courtesy of old loyalties to the Starks. Lord Manderley, cunning himself, kept a polite distance from Baish, though Sansa suspected he was waiting to see if the Vale Lord would show his hand. Word also reached them that Cersei Lannister, still reeling from her humiliation in King's Landing, had grown more paranoid and reclusive. Some said she was planning to dispatch envoys to the north to keep an eye on Sansa's doings. Others hinted that she might be too embroiled in the Faith's demands to focus on such distant matters. Sansa felt a constant undercurrent of worry. If the Crown decided she was overstepping her mandate, they might send an army north. She did not relish fighting a war against both Baish and the Lannisters. Late one evening, a flurry of riders arrived at the gates. Sansa was awakened by the clamor of voices in the courtyard. Dressing quickly, She rushed down to find a cluster of haggard men dismounting from exhausted horses. Their cloaks were rimed with ice, their faces etched with fear. One stumbled forward, handing her a small wooden token carved with the sigil of the Umber family, an enormous chained giant. Between gasping breaths, he told his tale. The last hearth had come under attack. At first, they believed it to be raiders, but the men they fought did not fall easily. The messenger's voice shook as he spoke of corpses rising again and strange shadows moving through the snow. Some fled south to seek help, while others stayed behind to defend their lands. The messenger believed the threat was heading toward the Umber seat in earnest. Sansa felt her heart pound. She had heard rumor. Yes, but hearing the words from an eyewitness was different. She glanced at Brienne, who wore a grim look of recognition. Baish, standing nearby, watched with narrowed eyes, as though trying to gauge whether this was an elaborate ruse. Sansa turned to the messenger. "Rest and eat. You have done well bringing this news." She convened an emergency gathering in the Great Hall, despite the late hour. Lords and knights stumbled in, yawning and irritated, only to grow sober when they heard the messenger's account. Many expressed disbelief, muttering that such tales of undead walkers were only fables. But the terror in the messenger's eyes could not be ignored. Sansa demanded that the hall fall silent. Then she spoke with careful authority. "The North has always known that beyond the wall, there are terrors we do not fully understand. The Night's Watch was formed for a reason. My father always taught me that wise rulers prepare for threats, even if those threats seem like old stories. If the Umbers are besieged by something unnatural, we must send aid." Lady Dustin bristled. "You would have us march north to fight walking corpses? You risk depleting our strength based on the ramblings of a terrified man." Sansa kept her voice level. "I risk far more if I ignore it. If it is raiders, we can defeat them. If it is something worse, we must see it for ourselves before it overruns us all. Lord Umber was loyal to Robb Stark. His house has bled for the North time and again. Would you have us abandon them?" A murmur of reluctant agreement passed through the lords, especially those who had once fought side by side with the Umbers. The Great Jon had been a pillar of Robb Stark's army, famed for his fierceness. Many had reason to respect House Umber. Baish stepped forward smoothly. "My lady, I have a contingent of knights at your disposal. Perhaps we can send a scouting force first to verify the scale of the threat." She could see the opportunism in his eyes. If he led a successful rescue, he might win over more northern hearts. But if the threat was real and truly dire, his knights might be lost. She weighed her options. "A scouting force is indeed wise," she said, "but it should be led by those who know the terrain best. I will coordinate the effort with men from the Glovers, the Flints, and any other house willing to spare a few. Your knights, Lord Baish, are welcome to join under our command. We act as one or not at all." A muscle in Bailish's cheek twitched. "I would be honored," he said quietly. "We are here to serve." Sansa looked to the assembled lords. "We ride for the last hearth in 3 days. We must gather supplies and ensure the castle is well defended in our absence. I will remain in Winterfell, as there is too much here that demands my attention, but I will appoint a commander to lead the relief force." Her gaze swept across the faces. "Who will step forward?" Men exchanged glances. Some were hesitant to volunteer for a fight against an enemy they did not fully believe in. Others were weighed down by the hardships of their own lands. At length, Cerbal Man, the senior Lannister knight, spoke up. "I will go, my lady. My men and I have fought many battles in the south. We do not fear a skirmish in the snow." Sansa gave him a measured nod, though she was uncertain of his motives. "Very well. You shall ride with men from the north. I ask Lord Glover to provide scouts and rangers who know the ground. And Brienne, if you are willing, I would trust you to oversee the conduct of this force, ensuring it acts in the best interests of the North." Brienne accepted. "I will ride with them, my lady, though my vow is to protect you. Are you sure you wish me away from Winterfell?" "I have capable defenders here," Sansa said, glancing at the lines of men in Stark livery. "And I must know the truth of what we face at the last hearth. I trust no one more than you to bring back honest word of it." So it was decided. Over the next 3 days, preparations filled Winterfell with frenetic energy. Horses were shod, wagons loaded with provisions. Hardtack, dried meats, flasks of strong ale, torches, blankets, anything that might be needed for a journey northward in winter. Lannister knights took stock of their swords and bows, while men from the Vale polished their bright helms and plate. Northern Rangers wore thick furs and carried hunting spears. Sansa had them all assemble in the courtyard before dawn on the day of departure. Her breath misted in the cold air as she addressed them. Ride swift. Assist the Umbers if they are under attack. If what you find is banditry, root it out. If it is something darker, observe carefully and return to warn us so we can rally the North. You bear not just the sigil of your own houses, but also the banner of Winterfell. Fight with honor and return safely. Brienne, mounted on a sturdy northern courser, bowed her head. Ser Balman saluted, and Baelish's knights formed a column. Soon, the portcullis rose and the force clattered out into the snowy wilderness, disappearing into the morning gloom. Sansa remained at the gate, arms wrapped around herself to fend off the chill, watching until the last rider vanished. Back in the Great Hall, she felt a pang of isolation. With Brienne gone, she had one fewer ally she could trust without question. Many of her new allies in the north were still uncertain, and Baelish's influence wove through the corridors. She had publicly bound him to the relief force, forcing his knights to serve under a joint command, but he himself had chosen to remain. He claimed his presence was needed to coordinate matters of logistics and diplomacy, but she suspected his real aim was to stay close to her, close to Winterfell's seat of power. All she could do was remain vigilant. The next few days passed with agonizing slowness. The cold intensified, thick icicles clinging to the edges of rooftops, swirling snow sometimes making it impossible to see beyond the castle walls. Sansa busied herself with the daily governance, ensuring that supplies were distributed fairly, adjudicating disputes among the small folk who had taken refuge in Winterfell, and exchanging letters with lords too distant to attend. She found herself in the solar late into the evenings, quill in hand, responding to every rumor or plea. She never showed her fatigue openly. The North needed to see that the Stark in Winterfell did not bend beneath winter's weight. Meanwhile, Baelish took every opportunity to meet with her privately. He would hover in the corridor, offering a cunning smile, or appear in the library while she researched old accounts of the long night. He teased her with half-spoken hints of potential alliances. He dropped the names of southern lords who might support her claims against any challenge. She responded with polite deflections, refusing to commit to any plan that would put the North in greater debt to him. Yet she knew she walked a razor's edge. She could not afford to openly alienate him, nor could she let him gain undue influence. Occasionally, she found herself missing the stark simplicity of Winterfell as it once was, with her father's clear sense of honor guiding every decision. Each dawn, Sansa looked for ravens bearing word from the relief force or from Jon at the wall. The days stretched on with no word. Lord Manderley grew restless, openly wondering if the entire mission had succumbed to the storms. Lady Dustin resumed her skepticism. Some men began to whisper that the Umbers must have already fallen, while others ventured that perhaps the Lannister knights had turned on them. Sansa tried to tamp down the rumors. She did not want panic to spread. Her nightmares returned, worse than before. In them, she saw an army of silent whites marching over snowbound fields, the faint glow of their eyes a pale blue in the darkness, drawing closer to Winterfell with every step. At last, news came, but not in the way she expected. A single rider from the relief force limped into the courtyard at twilight, his horse bleeding from multiple wounds. The man half collapsed off the saddle, babbling of horror. Guards rushed him to the maester's chambers. Sansa hurried after them, her heart in her throat. The man, whose name she learned was Tommer, gasped for breath on a pallet while Maester Colwyn tried to staunch the bleeding in his shoulder. Tommer's eyes rolled with fear. "Dead men," he wheezed. "Ser Balman led us north. We reached a village near the last hearth. It was, by the gods, of bodies everywhere. Then they rose. Men we'd known, rotted, half-frozen. They killed so many. We tried to burn them, but the snow was too heavy. We fell back. I got separated." Sansa knelt by his side, a candle illuminating the terror etched on his face. "What of Brienne and Ser Balman?" He shuddered. "They fought bravely. The Vale Knights too. We tried to retreat in good order, but the dead kept coming. Whites. That's what the men called them. Lady Brienne led a charge to protect those who fled. I saw her. I saw her fighting a giant white, big as a stable. Don't know if she... His voice broke as he coughed up blood. Sansa clenched her hands together, forcing herself to remain composed. Maester, do what you can, she said quietly, though she could see in Tomer's eyes that he was likely beyond saving. Turning to one of her guards, she spoke in a low tone. Find Lord Manderley and Lord Serwyn. Bring them here at once. She left Tomer in the Maester's care, her mind racing. If this account was true, if the dead truly walked in force, then everything she had been planning was overshadowed by a threat more terrifying than she could have imagined. The relief force might be wiped out, including Brienne, including the Knights of the Vale and the Lannister men. And if the Umbers had already fallen, the road lay open for the dead to march south. Baish found her in the corridor, drawn by the commotion. My lady, what has happened? His voice was urgent, but his eyes gleamed with that calculating spark. She told him briefly of Tomer's story. His expression darkened. Impossible, he muttered, though he did not sound entirely convinced. Legends from old Nan's tales. I once thought so too, Sansa replied, swallowing hard. But we cannot ignore the accounts of our own men. Whether it's a band of savage raiders or something worse, it's a threat we must face. Baish nodded, glancing around to see if others were listening. Then we must secure Winterfell. If these creatures exist in any significant number, we cannot send more men to be slaughtered. Better to hold the castle walls. Let them break themselves on our defenses. Sansa's first instinct was to reject that idea. She hated the notion of abandoning any survivors who still fought near the last hearth. But reason told her that rushing more men into a massacre would serve no one. She closed her eyes, recalling the Red Keep's lessons on ruthless pragmatism. We have to confirm what truly happened. Send out ravens to the Glover lands, to the Manderleys, to every house that might be near enough to know more. And yes, we must prepare for a siege if this threat moves south. By the time Lord Manderley and Lord Serwyn arrived, Sansa had steeled herself. She explained what little they knew, and they agreed to tighten Winterfell's defenses. Scouts would be dispatched in small, swift teams to see if any of the relief force remained or if Brienne still led a rearguard. Manderley, though shaken, asserted that White Harbor would send additional supplies to sustain a prolonged defense if needed. Serwyn began reorganizing the guard shifts. Baish slithered into the background, offering advice here and there, yet mostly observing. Sansa wondered what he was thinking. Did he see opportunity even in this horror? As night fell, Sansa stood atop the castle walls, the cold wind whipping her hair. Snow fell in heavy flakes, obscuring the land beyond a few hundred paces. She thought of the men and women who had marched north under her banner, possibly now lying dead in the snow. Or worse, wandering, reanimated in service to some unspeakable darkness. She shivered, less from cold than from dread. All her careful politicking, her struggle to assert control over the north, might be undone by an enemy that cared nothing for alliances or gold. She felt a strange calm settle over her, a realization that everything she had learned might be tested in a way she had never anticipated. In the weeks that followed, ravens flew out and returned with conflicting stories. Some reported sightings of tattered figures roaming the forests, others claimed entire villages had been found deserted with no sign of life. A few rangers actually made it back from the area near the last hearth, speaking of pyres built to destroy the dead. They confirmed that pockets of survivors fought under Brienne's leadership, trying to hold out in small fortifications, setting fire to anything that moved in the darkness. But every day they lost ground, forced to retreat further south. Sansa, from within the safety of Winterfell, could do little but organize caravans of supplies to preposition them near safe routes, hoping the survivors might access them. Meanwhile, Baish took to holding nightly gatherings in the Great Hall, urging the lords present to fortify themselves and not waste resources on what he deemed a doomed expedition. Though he did not openly contradict Sansa's orders, he sowed enough doubt to make some question whether Lady Stark was leading them into foolish battles. Yet Sansa held firm to her stance that they must attempt rescue wherever possible. She felt a responsibility that ran deeper than politics. These were her people, her father's bannermen, men who had once fought for Robb or who had survived the Bolton Terror. If she simply shut her gates and watched them perish, she would be no better than the tyrants who had come before her. One chilly morning, as a pale sun struggled to rise, a horn blast echoed from the ramparts. Guards rushed to the gates. Sansa, pulled from her chamber by the alarm, reached the courtyard just as the gates opened to admit a group of half-frozen, battered warriors. At their head rode Brienne of Tarth, her armor dented, a makeshift bandage wrapping her left arm. Behind her stumbled a mix of Vale Knights, Lannister soldiers, and Northern men, all showing signs of frostbite and wounds. Their eyes were haunted as if they had witnessed nightmares made real. Sansa ran forward, her heart pounding with relief. Brienne dismounted stiffly. "My lady," she said, voice hoarse, "we held as long as we could." Sansa reached to steady her, ignoring the blood and grime on the knight's cloak. "Thank the gods you're alive. Come inside, out of the cold." A wave of frantic activity followed. Stable hands took their horses, maesters rushed to tend the wounded, and Sansa summoned warm food and blankets. Everywhere, she heard the survivors murmuring about the horrors they had faced, glowing eyes in the darkness, bodies that refused to die, entire villages of the dead. Baish drifted at the periphery, listening intently. Ser Balman was nowhere among the returning men. When Sansa asked, Brienne shook her head grimly. He fell in battle, tried to lead a charge with the Lannister knights. They were overrun. We burned what bodies we could. In the privacy of Sansa's solar, Brienne gave a more detailed account. The Umbers were almost entirely lost. Some survivors joined our force, but we could not hold the last hearth. The rumors are true, my lady. The dead walk, and they walk in numbers beyond any I've seen. We destroyed some with fire or dragonglass arrows. There were a few. But every day more of them came, as if they were being guided by some evil will. Sansa felt a cold, sinking sensation. Dragonglass. The legends said it could kill White Walkers, and apparently it worked on Whites too, but they had precious little of it in the north, if any. "How far behind you are they?" she asked. Brienne frowned, considering. "Hard to say. The storm slowed them, but also slowed us. They don't fear the cold. If the tales of the Long Night hold true, they'll move steadily south, raising the dead as they go. If we do nothing, they will eventually reach us." Sansa clenched her jaw. Her entire focus had been on navigating the politics of the North, contending with the Lannisters and Baelish's schemes. Now, an ancient menace threatened to sweep aside all such struggles like leaves in the wind. "Then we must prepare Winterfell as a fortress against this threat," she said. "We can rally as many houses as possible, gather the people behind these walls. We must send ravens to King's Landing, to the Vale, to the Iron Islands if need be. We cannot face this alone." Brienne nodded, though she looked worried. "I fear we may not have much time." Sansa wasted no more of it. She set the great hall abuzz with orders. Crafters and blacksmiths were to begin forging weapons, especially if they had any knowledge of dragonglass. She ordered that any old caches of obsidian, rumored to be hidden in ancient crypts or storehouses, be found. Scouts would watch the northern roads, lighting signal fires if the dead drew close. Every house still loyal was urged to send men, supplies, horses. If the legends of the White Walkers were to be believed, even 1,000 swords might not suffice. But it was all they had. Baelish, far from fleeing, offered to send couriers back to the Vale for more knights. Sansa accepted his offer warily. She needed every sword she could get. Still, she braced for the price he would demand in return. The Lannisters were another problem. She had to decide whether to inform Tommen's court of the threat. If Cersei learned of the North's weakness, she might exploit it, but Sansa had no choice. The living had to unite, or the North would become a land of the dead. She composed a letter to King's Landing, explaining the situation and imploring them to send support. She suspected Cersei might ignore it or dismiss it as a stark trick, but she had to try. A flicker of hope came from the wall, in the form of a raven from Jon Snow. His words were curt and practical, acknowledging her letter and confirming the reports. "The Night's Watch has encountered the dead. We have joined forces with wildlings who survived the onslaught at Harhome. We are fortifying the wall, but do not know if it can stop what is coming. The living must stand together, or we shall fall. Jon Snow, 998th Lord Commander." Sansa read and reread the letter. For the first time in many years, she wished she could speak to Jon face to face, to share in the burdens they both carried. He asked for help in forging alliances, hinting that he hoped to move some wildling families to safer ground south of the wall. The idea would outrage certain northern lords, but if it meant bolstering their ranks against the dead, could they refuse? She pressed the letter to her chest, exhaling a trembling breath. If there was any way to unify the North, the Vale, and perhaps even the Lannisters to face this common enemy, she would have to find it. The intricacies of power games now paled beside the threat of a winter that could quite literally devour them. She ordered that a space be made in Winterfell's courtyard for any wildlings who might cross from the wall. Tents, fire pits, basic amenities, she instructed the stewards to prepare for the possibility of hundreds, even thousands, arriving. She knew that many northern lords would balk at hosting wildlings, but she no longer cared. Survival trumped old grudges. To that end, she made sure word spread throughout the castle how Stark welcomed all who would fight against the undead. Within a fortnight, the first ragged group of wildlings arrived, escorted by a handful of Night's Watch rangers. They were suspicious, guarded. The northern soldiers eyed them in turn, mutual hatred flaring in the air. But Sansa herself went out to meet them, wearing a heavy cloak stitched with the direwolf. She offered them what little comfort Winterfell could spare. Some spat on the ground, calling her kneeler, but others simply looked too weary to argue. They had seen the horrors of the dead. They understood that old enemies might have to become allies now. Baish watched it all with a detached interest, as though assessing how this would play into his schemes. He slipped into Sansa's solar one evening, feigning concern. "My lady, are you sure it's wise to allow these wildlings into Winterfell? The northern lords might feel betrayed." Sansa turned to face him, her posture unyielding. "They can feel what they wish. If the dead are truly coming, we will need every sword, every spear. The wildlings have faced the White Walkers before. They know the enemy better than we do." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You risk your standing, my lady. The people love you now for ousting the Boltons and reclaiming your seat. But if they see wildlings parading freely in the castle, they may question your judgment." She refused to waver. "Let them question it. I will answer with the truth. We cannot afford to kill each other when an army of the dead gathers. You may think me naive, Lord Baish, but I have stared into the eyes of men who have lost everything to those creatures. I will not turn them away." Baish bowed slightly. "You have grown strong indeed, Lady Sansa. Forgive me if I err on the side of caution. The Vale stands ready to support you, provided we can ensure stability." She recognized the veiled threat. Stability was Bailish's term for a controlled environment in which he could thrive. "I appreciate that," she said with cold politeness. "But my first priority is ensuring the North does not become a graveyard. If you wish to help, see that the Vale sends more men. We need them." He gave her one of his faint smiles. "As you command," he murmured, departing into the corridor's shadows. In time, more ravens arrived from the wall, from scattered outposts, from small folk fleeing the devastation. The scattered survivors who trickled in described entire hamlets wiped out, their inhabitants added to the enemy's ranks. Sansa convened constant meetings in the Great Hall, trying to develop a strategy. But the North was large, and their numbers too few to defend every point. All they could do was concentrate their strength at certain fortresses and hope to funnel the undead into winnable battles. The tales from the Age of Heroes suggested that the White Walkers had once been turned back, though the accounts were murky. Some said it was the magic of the children of the forest, others that it was the first men. The maesters scoured old manuscripts, searching for references to weapons or tactics that might tip the balance. Amid the looming catastrophe, politics did not vanish entirely. Lords still bickered over which region should receive precious resources. Vale Knights tried to claim privileges in Winterfell, and Baish subtly courted certain northern houses with offers of influence. Yet a sense of grim unity began to pervade the halls. The men and women of the North were no strangers to harsh conditions, and if their lady insisted this threat was real, they would stand with her. Their loyalty to House Stark was old and deep, older than the Targaryen conquest, older than any southern crown. Snow kept falling day after day, piling in drifts against the castle walls. Patrols returned with frostbitten faces and wide, fearful eyes. The enemy was out there, spreading like a silent plague. Then, one night, the horns sounded from the battlements. The alarm carried through the corridors, waking everyone from uneasy slumber. Sansa threw on her cloak and raced to the walls, heart pounding. The archers peered through the gloom at distant torches flickering in the dark. A small group approached the castle carrying a banner. As they came closer, the men atop the walls relaxed. It was not the undead, it was a Night's Watch contingent leading a group of weary travelers, wildlings by the looks of them, along with a man at their head wearing a dark cloak trimmed with black fur. Sansa realized with a jolt that it was Jon Snow. The gates swung open and he rode in with solemn purpose, dismounting near the center of the courtyard. A hush fell as the Watchers recognized the Lord Commander, a figure not seen in Winterfell since he left for the Wall as a youth. Snow still fell thickly and he looked older, leaner, with eyes that carried deep shadows. He spotted Sansa and paused, the flicker of torches illuminating his expression of amazement. She stepped forward uncertainly, remembering how distant she had felt from him when they were children. Now everything had changed. Neither moved for a long moment, the snow swirling around them, until at last she found her voice. "Jon." He inclined his head, his eyes searching her face. "Sansa. By the gods, it's good to see you alive." She felt tears prick at her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Too much had happened. She reached out and grasped his forearm, a gesture half formality, half familial closeness. "You've come to help," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. He nodded. "We don't have a choice. The army of the dead is real, and it marches south. The Wall may not hold forever." His eyes drifted around, taking in the Vale Knights and Lannister survivors mingling in the courtyard. "You've gathered quite a force." She gave a mirthless smile. "It's still not enough. We need every sword and spear we can find." Jon's gaze returned to her. "We'll fight together as we should have long ago. The Night's Watch can't intervene in the realm's politics, but this is no mere political struggle. It's life against death." Her heart felt tight with conflicting emotions, relief that Jon was here, dread of what they still had to face, and a quiet sense of wonder that two children of Ned Stark stood in the courtyard of Winterfell, faced with an enemy older than any kingdom. She swallowed, then beckoned him inside, out of the cold. Men parted to let them pass, some bowing to Sansa, others saluting Jon. Overhead, the Stark banner flapped in the freezing wind. In the days that followed, Jon and Sansa conferred at length, comparing reports and forging a united strategy. He had brought wildling chieftains who respected his leadership, though they eyed the Winterfell lords warily. Jon spoke bluntly of the horrors beyond the Wall, of how the Night King, an ancient White Walker, led his legion of the dead with an intelligence beyond mere beasts. Their only hope lay in uniting every faction of the living, from the Crown in King's Landing to the Knights of the Vale to the scattered free folk. A near impossible task, yet any lesser effort would likely end in annihilation. Sansa included Baish in some of these councils, watching him closely. He was courteous, offering his usual brand of subtle manipulations, favors to ensure the Vale Knights cooperated fully, proposals to broker an alliance with certain lords in the Riverlands. Jon remained politely distant with him, seemingly aware of his reputation. Often, after Baish departed, Jon would quietly ask Sansa if they could truly trust him. She would sigh and admit no. "But we must use every resource at our disposal. Right now, that includes him." Meanwhile, ravens flew out again, this time carrying Jon's personal testimony. He pleaded for aid from the southern houses, from the Iron Islands, from Dorne, anyone who might listen. Many would ignore it, but perhaps a few might rally. Sansa also kept a watchful eye on Cersei's potential response. If the Queen Mother decided to label Jon and Sansa as traitors, they could face a southern invasion at the very moment they needed unity most. Snow piled higher, and the days became an endless cycle of planning, drilling soldiers, and anxiously awaiting news. A kind of calm overtook Winterfell, the quiet hush before a storm of unimaginable fury. Some nights, Sansa would stand on the ramparts with Jon, looking north. The wind stung their cheeks, but they felt no urge to retreat to warmth. They found a shared solace in the silence, both remembering their father's words about the long winter nights that tested a leader's resolve. One such night, as they stared into the dark, Jon said softly, "Thank you, Sansa, for holding Winterfell, for keeping the North alive." She glanced at him. "I only did what I had to do. I made choices that. I'm not proud of all of them. I've become someone I barely recognize. But I refuse to let our home fall again." He nodded, his breath steaming in the frosty air. "Then we stand together. The Wall, Winterfell, the free folk, even the Vale, if it comes to that. We make our stand here, the living against the dead." Sansa felt a fierce rush of clarity. All her years of enduring torment in King's Landing, her intricate games of politics, her uneasy alliance with the Lannisters. It all culminated in this moment, a last stand for the survival of the realm. She thought of her father, who had warned that winter was coming. She thought of her mother, whose fierce love drove Brienne to vow to protect her daughters. She thought of Robb, who had dreamed of a free north. If they were watching now, would they understand why she had done all she did? Perhaps. Or perhaps they would simply be proud that she still stood, unbroken. She turned to Jon, her voice quiet but resolute. If this is the last stand, then House Stark will not face it alone. We have a chance to forge something better, a realm that knows unity, not just endless war. Or we die trying. Either way, we do not yield. Jon's eyes reflected the faint light of the torches, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. They said nothing more, just stood side by side, gazing into the wintry void. Far in the distance, the faintest flicker of a watchfire glowed. Beyond it lay darkness, and within that darkness, an ancient threat stirred. But within Winterfell's walls, a spark of hope remained. A Stark daughter who had learned to play the Game of Thrones, and a bastard son who had risen to command. United at last, they prepared to face the storm that would decide the fate of Westeros. And so winter's night deepened, the wind howling across the battlements. Snow drifted against the doors, and the hearts of the people within beat in fearful unison. Yet candlelight still glowed in the windows, the fires of defiance burning against the cold. For all the cunning alliances and betrayals that had shaped her journey, for all the debts owed to Southern power, Sansa Stark stood as the unbowed guardian of her father's legacy. The North would not surrender easily, and as the hours of darkness drew on, they braced themselves for the dawn, or for the darkness that might swallow dawn forever.